So, hello everyone. Welcome to the Group of 78th Annual Policy Conference 2022 on Transforming International Finance toward Economic, Social, and Planetary Justice. This is day 2 of our conference. We started on Friday, the 23rd of September, late last week. And the conference got off to a great start on Friday with presentations by Jim Stanford, Richard Kozel-Wright, and Senator Rosa Galvez. My name, by the way, is Roy Culpepper. I chair the Group of 78. Unfortunately, due to illness, Grace Blakely had to withdraw at the last minute. Nonetheless, based on an 11-minute video clip of Grace speaking about financialization, we had a good discussion led by Jen Hassan and Angela McEwen. Now, our student rapporteur team is busy taking notes and will distill key messages and recommendations of the conference that they see emerging from the discussion. So I won't steal the thunder of our students, and I won't try to give a comprehensive summary of Friday's enormously rich presentations and discussions. However, I thought it might be useful for those who were not present in person or virtually for me to say that some very positive shafts of light illuminated a discussion in which, let's say, gloom is usually expected to prevail. So Jim Stanford adduced evidence to show that a fair transition for workers away from fossil fuel production is very feasible given the size and dynamics of the labor market. Jim argued that phasing out fossil fuel production and consumption in Canada can easily be achieved in 20 years without one person being laid off, showing that economic and social justice and ecological sustainability can, in fact, converge. Although Jim added the proviso that, of course, these things would happen much better with a plan than without a plan. In other words, not to let market forces simply rule the transition. So how is this to be done in the real world and specifically in the Canadian context? We had Senator Rosa Galvez, who talked about the bill she has introduced into the Senate, the Climate Aligned Finance Act, which has followed extensive consultations and research and is now looking for legislative and political allies to get enacted. The fundamental premise of the conference was reaffirmed by Richard Kozel-Wright, director of the Globalization Division at UNCTAD, that in order to achieve our economic, social, and ecological goals, international finance and multilateral institutions must be transformed to serve these objectives rather than to undermine them as they frequently do. I should add that a video recording of Friday's conference will be uploaded shortly to the G78 website for those who missed it and would like to view it. This week, we're going to continue the discussion, but we'll drill down in our analysis from the global stratospheric level that we were at on Friday. Today, we will be drilling down into the currency system, how to inform the international currency system. Tomorrow, into the scope for a greater role for domestic institutions and policies if we're going to transform finance. And on Wednesday, we will drill down into the democratization of financial innovation. So all that said, let me now briefly introduce Eric Helleiner, our distinguished moderator for today's session. Eric is a professor in the Department of Political Science and Balsillie School of International Affairs at the University of Waterloo, Canada. He is a prolific scholar in the field of international political economy of financial markets and institutions. His recent books include The Status Quo Crisis, Global Financial Governance After the 2008 Meltdown, and The Forgotten Foundations of Bretton Woods. Many might be familiar with one of his earliest publications, States in the Reemergence of Global Finance, from Bretton Woods to the 1990s. Indeed, Eric has been thinking and writing about these issues for the past 30 years. So it's a great honor and pleasure to introduce Eric as our moderator for this session. Eric.
Great. Thanks so much, Roy. And thanks for the kind words of introduction. And just like to welcome everybody to this session. I'm really delighted to be part of a conference on the theme of transforming international finance. We certainly need to transform international finance at this moment where we need new ideas. We're on the edge of what I think is likely to be a spreading international debt crisis with U.S. rates rising. We're at the kind of cycle. The dollar cycle usually coincides with the global financial cycle. And so we're at a very vulnerable and dangerous moment at the same time that we have no clear mechanism for debt restructuring still, many decades after this has been talked about, and questionable means of financing countries that get into debt crises. So it's a really a difficult and dangerous moment, and important to be discussing new ideas. So this panel is going to be discussing a specific aspect of global finance, which is the monetary side, the currency system. So this is a system dominated by the US dollar, but really at a time where US global economic and political power is waning. And as Mark Carney said in his famous 2019 speech at Jackson Hole, just to quote him, any unipolar system is unsuited to a multipolar world. And there is, great resentment around the world about this mismatch between US dollar dominance in the international currency system. And even in the United States itself, many people feel the US currency has too large a global role. So that's what the speakers will be talking about. It's linked to the first issue that I raised in the sense that US dollar dominance is being is one of the transmission mechanisms by which rising U.S. interest rates are affecting everybody. And so it is raising a question of how it might be possible to transform that currency order and what the alternatives might be. And we've got two great speakers to speak about each of those two themes. So let me introduce them very quickly. We'll start with Matías Fernango, who's going to be speaking about the future of the dollar itself. Perfect person to be discussing this. Matías is a professor of economics at Bucknell in Pennsylvania, and he's published widely on the subject. I've assigned many of his articles in my courses. He's widely published in the academic world, but he also has extensive policy experience. He was a senior research manager at the Central Bank of Argentina. He's been a consultant to the ILO, UNCTAD, CEPAL, and UNDP, and other organizations. That's just mentioning a few of them. And then we'll turn to Mark Plant, who will be speaking about the alternatives, specifically about the future of the SDR, the reserve asset that the IMF manages. Again, perfect person to be speaking about this issue. He's a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington. Before that, taught economics at UCLA. He's worked in the IMF in many different capacities. Particularly relevant, I think, to this panel is his work in the Strategy, Policy, and Review Department, including on the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative and Highly Indebted Poor Country Initiative. And so has extensive experience understanding this from the inside. So each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have time for question and answer. So if you have some questions, please post them through the Zoom function, and we'll see if we can get to all of them in the time that we have. So over to you, Matías.
Well, thank you, Roy. Thank you, Eric, again, for the very nice introduction. To me, it's a pleasure to be here. I emphasize what Roy said at the beginning. I actually do cite it here in the PowerPoint. The book by Mark states and by Eric states and the emergence of global finance was very formative in my way of thinking about certain of these issues. And so it's a pleasure to be here in this panel and with you and Mark to discuss these issues. This was a paper, I'm going to present a very brief version of this. This was a paper that originally was published in the Review of Political Economy and was commissioned actually for the 50th anniversary of the collapse of Bretton Woods. If you take August 15th of 1971 and the closing of the gold window as being the end of the system. And it was jointly with a paper by Barry Eichengreen, and what I tried to do is think a little bit of what when it was commissioned. I knew that Barry was going to write the other paper to try to provide a counterpoint to what I think Barry's views are, which I think are the conventional wisdom on not just the collapse perhaps of Bretton Woods, but also on the collapse of the gold standard and and many other issues in international finance. And so my views are built around, in part, as I said, certainly Eric's ideas here play a role in suggesting that the conventional view is not completely correct, but tie in those views, which I read as suggesting that the reasons for the collapse of Bretton Woods are not structural or economic in nature, but political, and that the political decisions, the political coalitions did matter in bringing down Bretton Woods. I tie that to some heterodox ideas about the functioning of the monetary system. And so that is probably the sort of contribution to this debate. And it builds on some ideas. Yeah, perhaps you can see there in the bottom, Mr. Raul Prebic, so some structuralist ideas, not of Prebic in this particular case, of Maria da Conceição Tavares, a Brazilian economist who is still around. She's 92 years old, I should say, that suggested that the end of Bretton Woods did not mark the end of dollar hegemony, but quite the opposite. The culmination of a process in which the dollar sort of rose to the top, and some of these ideas, I should say, are also in many other thinkers that are worth mentioning. But I would say Susan Strange would be also somebody that I cite, and I think would have similar ideas. So I'm going to try to very briefly go through those two ideas. There are many other things here that are not that important for us. I think the paper does discuss history in many ways, but I should say that my preoccupation is as an economist of I'm not a historian. For sure. And so I'm a historian of thought, and as that I do some archival work and some work that is similar to historians, but certainly here there is no original data or looking at archives or any thick description of the facts behind the collapse of Bretton Woods. Is, as I said, a work that tries to think conceptually, two ways of thinking about the collapse of Bretton Woods, and of course, connecting some of the dots of the historical, facts to those two views in a way that might be illustrative of what happened. But again, not work in history. So the conventional view is, I think, well known. And, there are different variations of the story, but I think that they can be unified into one sort of broad discourse. So the broad discourse is that at the end of the day, there was overissue of dollars. That overissue of dollars, eroded the confidence on the dollar as a reserve currency, and the increase in disproportion during the 60s between the actual gold reserves and the degree of liquidity in the global economy, led eventually and forced the United States to abandon the parity, and hence one might take the closing of the gold window then as a suitable sort of ending for the Bretton Woods regime. The alternative view would suggest that actually, and I should say historically, it's important to know that normally the collapse of the hegemonic position of the other sort of currencies that dominated, and I'm off the bat saying very Eurocentric view here of the functioning of the international financial system, not because, in the paper I say, the pound, and because if you go back in history, I say also, and tend to think in terms of the guilder and the Venetian ducat and so on and so forth, going to the Middle Ages, when they were clearly not globally dominating, in the same sense that you can think of the pound and certainly the dollar these days. So, having that as an important footnote in what I'm saying. But, what I think it's important to understand is that the collapse of the pound, and in that sort of long sort of crisis of the interwar period, is a collapse that of not just the hegemonic position of the United Kingdom, but also of the pound as the key currency in the system. And once you think a little bit historically at what happens in the in the post-Bretton Woods period, it's far from, perhaps that's ahead of me, but, because I'm organizing this in a different way. So it's far from clear that the United States actually suffered from a significant collapse. What lay ahead historically after the 70s, this period of crisis that seemed that the United States didn't have control of the system, is the complete victory in the Cold War, the collapse of the wall, for using a symbolic sort of, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the establishment of the Washington Consensus. So it is the dominance of Friedman and neoliberalism in thinking, and not the collapse of the position of the United States, on a global position or intellect, or if you think not just in terms of the actual raw real power, but in terms of the battle of ideas also. So all of those things are sort of maintained in place. The position of the dollar, as a reserve currency also doesn't change much. And here I cite, and again, I'm not sure how useful this is because I'm jumping on different things, but I cite a paper we wrote with a student of mine that it's published in the Review of International Political Economy and RIPE, in which we sort of showed, this was almost a decade ago, 2013, after the collapse of, the previous sort of financial cycle, and which is still, as Eric suggested at the beginning, dominated by the United States. That once you adjust for the fluctuations of the value of the dollar, the position of the dollar as a reserve in central banks has not changed significantly. It's about 60% of global reserves. The euro more or less is, again, fluctuates because the value of the dollar fluctuates and the value of the euro fluctuates. It's more or less where the position of the German mark and the French franc were before. If you add them, it's essentially more or less ballpark the same. So there is no significant change. And so the suggestion in this alternative view is that you have to think of money not as this instrument that allows to build confidence, a mentalist conception of money, as I say here, but you have to think of money in terms of what Keynes referred to as as a unit of account, as a fundamental sort of function of money, and one that it was power. That ultimately, he says that money is like language. It's at the end of the day, who determines the dictionary that matters, and in that sense, it's associated to the military dominance of the United States globally. Something that we see. We can talk about the not just the American military bases abroad, but even the proxy war in the Ukraine that shows. And issues obviously in Taiwan that suggests that the United States still is, even though there is a serious challenge, and that serious challenge comes from the industrial side, and that obviously will have and does have impacts on the military and hence on hegemonic power, but that it's still too soon to get to that. So those two views lead to very different understanding, I think, of the problem. I'm going to jump completely out of this. So one is a chartal view of money, the other is a metalist view of money, if you want, and I think that those underpin those two very different things. I'm going to go directly to the conclusions, And what I think it's important in this is I don't want by any means to suggest that the dollar is unassailable and that there is no possibility that the dollar would eventually lose its position as the key international currency. And I should say on this, both me and Barry were quite in agreement, I think, at the end of our two very different talks on what we thought was the causes of Bretton Woods collapse, which says, sometimes on policy issues, very different sort of conceptual issues may sort of reach a certain agreement. And the reason is that both of us think that there is a challenge, but that challenge is far away. So however you construct, this sort of notion of confidence, so Barry would put more emphasis on the relevance of democratic factors and the fact that China is not an open society. I would put more emphasis on the fact that, geopolitically, China may be disputing whether Taiwan is, a province of China or not, but they're certainly not thinking of putting military bases, or boats around Cuba. And so that the asymmetry still in terms of this dispute of power is too large to even consider that these are, challenges that imply in the short run possible change in the monetary system. So what I think, if I may, I don't know, I'm assuming I have very little time left, but what I'll try to conclude, is thinking not just beyond, the future, is saying something about the way I think the monetary system now has worked. So I think that Eric is particularly important in suggesting that the hikes of rates in the United States, which are at this point very much like in the 70s, concerned fundamentally with issues of inflation in the United States. So I don't think that anybody at the Fed, Powell, is thinking about what's going on in Argentina. But Argentina is on the verge of a collapse, very much so. And I think that the difference with the 70s and what happened in the international monetary system from that initial collapse of Bretton Woods to this new flexible dollar system, as Franklin Serrano calls this system. I call it sometimes dollarization lato sensu instead of stricto sensu, like in Ecuador. It's a global dollarization. We're in a dollarized system, broadly speaking, everybody to lesser or greater degree. But the flexible dollar standard is that the countries that manage to accumulate significantly large amounts of reserves have been able to some degree, isolate themselves from the vagaries of American monetary policy. Of course, in that, and I conclude with this, I think that SDRs, as Mark will talk later, might have an important role in changing things. But whether that will sort of happen or not it's anybody's guess. Thank you. Sorry for overpassing my time.
No, that's great, Matthias. Thanks so much for getting us started about thinking about the dollar's future. And you have such a nice segue over to Mark's theme. So over to you, Mark.
Just trying to share my screen here. Let me, there we go. Oops. Sorry about this. There we go. Are you seeing the PowerPoint?
Yes, that's great.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Eric, and thank you to the group of 78 for inviting me to this interesting discussion about the international monetary system. I'm going to start my presentation with a video which summarizes really in a couple minutes and some simple pictures, the basic points I want to make, the idea that I am putting forward. And I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about why this idea is so difficult to implement. So first to the video.
Storms, floods, droughts. The fight against climate change is a fight for existence. It's a fight that will last decades, maybe centuries, and cost tens of trillions of dollars. That's why we need to invest in solutions now. In 2021, the International Monetary Fund issued special drawing rights, which are essentially emergency funds to every member country. However, many high-income countries don't need these funds, so the funds just sit in the central banks. And these central banks can't invest the funds directly in the countries that need them. So what if we invested funds through multilateral development banks instead? The MDBs are highly rated, safe investments and front runners in the fight against climate change. In 2020 alone, they invested more than $66 billion in climate solutions. If we integrate special drawing rights into the multilateral development banks, we can invest up to 5 times their amount, speeding the progress of climate change mitigation and adaptation while maintaining a stable balance sheet. The cost is low and the gains are exponential, and may just mean our survival.
So that's a simple idea. You use SDRs to supplement multilateral development bank capital, but it's a complicated idea to implement. If you ask a development economist what happened during the COVID crisis to global reserves, most development economists would say, well, the global reserves must have gone down. This was a crisis period and you use up reserves. Monetary economists scoff at that idea and say, no. During COVID, there was a huge influx of central bank paper basically into the system, and people built up reserves. And in fact, the monetary economists are right. If you look at this chart, during 2020 and 2021, global reserves went up significantly. So the amount of cash sitting in central bank balance sheets increased. But this wasn't even across the world by any means. What you see is, in fact, is the global reserves increased a great deal in the developed countries, and also, interestingly, in the higher middle-income countries. China and India accumulated a great amount of reserves during this period, where the lower middle-income countries and the least developed countries, the low-income countries, mostly lost reserves. And so you see the countries, the low-income countries, confronting a reserves crisis through the COVID and now into the Ukrainian crisis, while reserves are building. And so there seems to be a disequilibrium in the system. Early in the period, people recognized this problem and suggested that the IMF emit special drawing rights, the IMF reserve currency, which they did in August 2021 to all countries in the world. But the rules of the IMF SDR distribution dictated that they distribute according to the voting power of the IMF. And so most of the reserves, these extra reserves, the SDRs, went to the high income countries, as you can see from this chart, about 70%. Only 2% went to low-income countries, although that's higher than the total amount of, or their percentage of reserves, global reserves as a whole. So there was a slight augmentation of reserves in favor of low-income countries and lower middle-income countries, but not very much. The reserves, the SDRs, were sitting idle on upper high-income countries' balance sheets. And so there was a suggestion that these SDRs be recycled somehow. They be given from the high-income countries to the lower-income countries to comfort their dwindling reserve position. This has sort of been done. The G20 put forward in October 2021 the objective of recycling $100 billion worth of SDRs from from high-income countries to low-income countries. Very few have actually happened yet. But the paths by which these SDRs are going to be recycled, hopefully, are mostly through the IMF. The suggestion was made that the high-income countries lend their reserves, their SDRs, to the Poverty Reduction Growth Trust. That's the IMF facility that in turn on-lends to low-income countries. And the IMF established the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which is meant to lend money to middle-income countries and low-income countries to aid in their transition from high carbon to a low carbon economy. Recognizing this would have substantial costs over the long term, this is a fairly long-term loan facility that the IMF is proposing. Nothing has been lent yet, but it's in process. The key in this process that the G20 insisted on is that if these SDRs are lent from high-income country central banks to others, to others, that their reserve asset characteristic, the notion that the SDR is a reserve asset characteristic, be maintained. And there are two characteristics that sort of make up this notion. One is that they be risk-free. And the IMF has set up a complicated set of auxiliary funds to ensure that any funds given from a high-income country central bank to the IMF maintain roughly risk-free. Secondly, that they're encashable, that should a high-income country get into reserves trouble and want its SDRs back from the IMF, there's a way to get them back. And again, the IMF has built a fairly complicated apparatus ensuring that should that rare event happen, the countries can get their SDRs back. This essentially allows central banks to have their cake and eat it too, in the sense that they can support these structures at the IMF, but at the same time, the SDRs continue to look like reserves on their balance sheet. What the central bankers are after is making sure that these SDRs are used for monetary purposes and don't seep over, if you will, to be used for fiscal purposes. And this is in some ways is the great dividing line for central bankers. They want their reserves to stay out of the hands of their governments. I would contend that there's another alternative here besides the IMF, and that would be to recycle SDRs to multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank. There are a set of about 10 to 15 institutions in the world that could receive these SDRs. In doing so, you in some sense transform the SDR from a monetary asset to a fiscal asset. Let me explain what I mean by that. The MDBs, the multilateral development banks, have an expertise that the IMF doesn't have. If you're going to try to use these reserves to support the transition to a global economy, you need to be able to support investment projects over the longer term. The IMF doesn't know how to do that. The MDBs do know how to do that. And so they have an expertise that will will facilitate the transition in a meaningful way. They're very conservatively managed. Most MDBs have a AA or AAA rating. Therefore, they're sound financial institutions. No MDB has ever gone bankrupt. No MDB has, in fact, there are very few that have had any non-performing loans. They're very conservatively managed, and they occupy a preeminent position in the global financial system. The SDRs could be lent to these MDBs as capital. So they wouldn't be converted into loans themselves. The SDRs wouldn't be loaned out, but they'd provide part of the capital base of the multilateral development bank. And given that the multilateral development banks have fairly high leverage ratios, they could take these, say, $1 trillion of global reserves in SDRs. That's just 7% of the total global reserves. And the MDBs can use that increase in their capital base to leverage the funds, borrow money from the financial markets up to 3 to 5 times as much. So they can leverage their $1 billion into $3 to $5 billion worth of firepower. This would be a huge increase in the multilateral development bank's portfolio potential without a lot of risk to the international financial system. What's preventing this from happening is really that to leverage these SDRs, they have to be considered as capital at the MDBs. The rating agencies have to look at whatever arrangement is made and see that these SDRs are capital. Capital is at risk. Central bankers don't want their SDRs at risk. Capital is not encashable. You can't suddenly draw it back when you need it. And again, central bankers want that ability to do so. The African Development Bank, among others, are looking at a concept of hybrid capital that combines debt and equity to finance, and a set of arrangements that would allow the SDRs to count as capital, but still not be permanently given to the multilateral development banks. And you can find mutual arrangements should withdrawal be needed that it can be done. They've done this at the MDBs, at the IMF. So in the end, what you have here is a divide where you're having a monetary asset and you're moving it over into institutions whose primary purpose is fiscal, not monetary. You're crossing that divide. But my point would be that you have $13.8 trillion worth of reserves sitting on central bank balance sheets. Mostly these go unused. We can take a small portion with minimal risk and make them look like capital, leverage private markets, and use that leverage power to in fact increase the capacity of these important institutions to get to the kind of transition that we want to take place. Let me stop there. I'm sure there'll be questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. It's very, very interesting proposal that I hope we have a chance to discuss. So maybe I can just start things off by asking a question to both of you. Matthias, in a sense, what you were suggesting to us is that the dollar's position has been sustained by politics, by U.S. power in a broad kind of sense, like its security power. And I just wondered if I was reading the Financial Times this morning, and Rana Fruhar's column was, essentially about how the Fed is, increasingly trying to offload, get out of QE, but there's not enough buyers, and banks don't have the capacity in a kind of intermediary role because of the capital rules post 2008, and she was suggesting, that's actually the thing that may cause trouble for the US dollar, the liquidity in the US Treasury bill market. In other words, the kind of classic things that Barry Eichengreen was pointing to, which is, the dollar is sustained by the attractiveness of that incredibly large and liquid US Treasury market. But if it was suddenly not liquid because of conditions that are emerging right now, would that be something that might change? And I was reminded just listening to, I actually looked it up while you were speaking, of Rudy Dornbush, who once said the following quote, where he said, in economics, things take longer to happen than you think they will. That's kind of, US dollar has stayed so much longer in the global world. But then he said, but then they happen faster than you thought they would.
They take forever, then very fast.
Yes,
very slow and then very fast.
Exactly. So my question to you would be, is the power kind of security story, maybe it's only just one part of the story. There is still the classic stuff around liquidity. And Mark, what I was wondering in your case was around your question of what is preventing this. And so, I'm a political scientist by training. And I also lived through the post-2008 debates about the SDR. And you could really see that US Congress was very nervous about giving the SDR a bigger role. And presumably US Congress would be needed to be on side this kind of a change, or maybe that's a question. Are you developing it in a way that it doesn't require congressional approval? But if it did require congressional approval, in a time of kind of inflationary, concerns about central banks doing unusual things, would this be perceived as yet another thing? Turning a monetary reserve asset into a fiscal instrument sounds a bit like things that people are nervous about at this particular moment. So that's just a couple quick questions just to get the ball rolling. Matthias.
Yes, very briefly. So I think, as you said, that would be, I suppose, the Financial Times sort of view would be the conventional sort of explanation of this. What I would argue is, so there is an interesting discussion on what has caused all of these interest rates to be very low and the incredible amount of liquidity, accumulation of reserves, which, and QE and all of those things, that happened after the 2008, 9 crisis, and there is an extensive literature. I actually have done a little review of that literature for a book that I just presented there in Toronto, in Canada. Which is that, the natural rate of interest, that's the way, they don't use the term very often, but they sometimes do, central bankers, it's negative. And the reasons tend to be, I think, the vast majority of the authors, I would say, if you look at Charles Goodhart, Paul Krugman, that was here at Bucknell, suggested that, although he doesn't say that on a paper, but, he started his literature on the liquidity trap more than 20 years ago in the case of Japan, but he has been sort of the key author on that. Bernanke, all of those suggest that interest rates are low, the natural rates that are pushing everything because of essentially things on the savings side. So it has something to do with savings and demographics and the labor force. The only one that would be different is it's Larry Summers that suggests that it's issues that are closer to what Gordon calls the third industrial revolution, and that there is less investment. And so he thinks in terms of the investment schedule and so on and so forth. What I would suggest, and so again, here, what I think it's a difference between the conventional explanations, be that Larry Summers or, the more, savings side of the story, is that interest rates have been low because of financial deregulation. So the same thing that ended Bretton Woods, that you analyze and suggest Wall Street wanted to end Bretton Woods and wanted the regulation and liberalization and all of those things that were part and parcel of the Washington Consensus, led to more financial crisis. Private agents are more leveraged. Countries are more leveraged, particularly those as shown by in a very nice graph by Mark, that lost reserves are in trouble. So those are the countries in trouble. And it's in that sense that I don't think that the U.S., not because of the external reasons, but because of the internal reasons, if they keep hiking interest rates here, they'll throw the economy into a severe recession, and a lot of indebted, sort of agents, firms, homeowners, will be in trouble and will be forced to rescue them. And so I don't think that the rates of interest in real terms have been in the United States for the last 20 years almost always negative. And yet the position of the dollar has not changed. And so I think that that's the interesting question to be asked. Why the dollar remains the key currency, not with very low rates of interest, with negative rates of interest in real terms. So that's the sort of And so I don't think it's purely a question of the economic gains. It has something to do with the geopolitical position of the United States, in which, as you know, the very little oil and natural gas that Russia is selling, they're still selling in dollars. And that has to say something about all of this.
Great. Mark.
Thanks for your question. I think in the end, this decision will be fundamentally political, but I think it's at a couple of different levels. I think there's a political level that always exists, that exists in every country between the central bank and the Minister of Finance, if you will. He's a pot of money sitting at the central bank that they'd like access to. And there's always a good reason, especially in a developing country, but throughout the world, to have access to that money. And the central banker says, no, I'm sorry, we are holding these for a very specific purpose. It's to ensure the smooth functioning of the financial system. It's to ensure that exports and imports can flow at a reasonable pace. And we need this cushion. And there's a long debate over what the size of that cushion should be. And if you look at the literature on how big reserves should be, I mean, it's a complicated literature. And I think I'm not deep in it, but what I've read of it, it's not conclusive by any means. So I think there's going to be the eternal tension, if you will, between the Minister of Finance, if you will, who wants to spend something, and the central bank governor who wants to save it. I think there's a larger question that's related to the things that Matthias is talking about, is who gets access to the pool of global reserves that exists. The IMF was very much designed as a reserve pooling mechanism, if you will. We're going to have international crises, and when one country goes into crisis, you want to be able to have some function that you can help that country out so that it doesn't infect the rest of the world. And the SDR is very much part of that system, but it's a very clumsy system, I think, and a very inflexible system, the way it's put together. And I think the question will be, can you loosen that system up or not? And inevitably, that means the shareholders of the IMF and the shareholders of the various development banks are going to get involved. And that's where it comes back to local politics. And in fact, what you've seen is with the US Congress, the administration went to Congress with a proposal to recycle certain number of the US's new SDRs to the IMF. So we're not even talking about moving over to the multilateral development banks. And the Congress said no. And it was because of the 50-50 split in the Senate. But it wasn't because of the reasons you were suggesting, Eric, that there was a monetary a worry about inflation, a worry about some money. It was, these SDRs, they're somehow going to be used to help Russia or China, or it was very sort of geopolitically unpleasant. This was before the Ukrainian war. And it was just seen, the word got out that Venezuela got some SDRs. Oh my God, something's wrong with the system. We're going to vote no. And in the 50-50 Congress, it's easy to get that kind of thing going. So I think the sell to MDBs would be indeed difficult. But in some ways, this doesn't, the message has to get through. This doesn't cost the US taxpayer anything to just install these SDRs, if you will, at the MDBs. It leverages the power of the MDBs. Now, maybe you don't like MDBs, but it does give them more lending power at no cost to the US taxpayer. And if you don't do this, you're going to have huge costs later on if we don't deal with the transition that's before us. There are lots of steps there to convince politicians that they have to take, but I think they're steps that a reasonable politician could understand.
But can I just follow up? Under your proposal, would it require congressional approval? Like, would there be a...
Well, if the U.S. were to participate, it would require congressional approval, yes. Okay, but it doesn't require the U.S. to participate. And in fact, the African Development Bank, who's developing a proposal, is looking at using money from the United Kingdom, from Canada, and 3 or 4 other donors who have indicated a willingness to do this. Every country has a different set of legislative rules surrounding who the SDR belongs to and how it can be spent. And so you have to go through, if you will, 190 member countries to understand what countries could contribute and what countries couldn't. The UK, the SDRs actually belong to the government, and the government can do this essentially, given the parliamentary system, can do this at will, if you will.
So I'm not seeing any questions, but please, people in the audience, please feel free to ask questions, because otherwise you're going to hear me asking questions, because I have lots. So I do want to follow up, Mark, with just one thing. Again, I'm just thinking of the politics, because I find the proposal extremely interesting. What was interesting in the video was really highlighting that this is something to do a long-term problem like climate change. And I'm just wondering if another potential source of resistance to it might be that here we are on the verge, at least in my mind, of widespread debt crises. And so the reserve function of the SDR, in a sense, is about to become very significant once again. And so is that a political issue in the sense you're asking the reserve function to do something that isn't what its original intention was at the very moment that the original intention is needed?
Yeah, I think it is. But you injected a huge amount of extra SDRs into the system. And if you look at how these SDRs have been used, so we injected about $650 billion worth of SDRs into the system on a base of $250 billion. And what you've seen is that the low-income countries, the ones who are reserve constrained, if you will, have made use of those SDRs. They converted them to hard currency and spent them, or paid back debt. They've done a variety of things with them. But the upper-income countries haven't. Switzerland's reserves have gone up by 30-40%. Maybe it's not that high. Maybe it's 20% in the course of the crisis. Okay, so in some sense, I have a sense that there's a set of assets sitting there going mostly unused. And again, I'm not suggesting we go out and spend the reserves on vaccines, or spend the reserves on hydropower, or spend the reserves on presidential palaces. I'm suggesting we put the reserves into sound financial institutions as a capital base, and then leverage other money with that. Yes, it puts the system a bit at risk. It does something else, something different with the SDRs. But it really is, fundamentally, I'm saying, should we be doing something slightly different with global reserves than just using them as a monetary instrument?
Right. So we do have two questions that have come in now. One from Manfred Bienefeld, who's asking, he's saying both of these excellent presentations emphasize Keynes's insistence that free international capital flows are incompatible with sovereign national economic management. The first one persuasively suggests that the end of Bretton Woods rupture was about moving to a system of free international capital movement based on the US dollar based on power, with the second presentation explaining that the recycling of SDRs is dependent on finding a way of doing it that does not allow the funds to be used by political actors in the receiving countries. So the question that this then raises is whether the use of these funds by the MDBs in accordance with neoliberal rules would result in sustainable development. So I think that question is for you, Mark. But actually it might also be for you now that I think about it, Matthias. And then the other question is from Diane McIntyre, who's asking how many MDBs currently exist and who exactly manages them. So maybe I'll give to you first, Mark.
Sure. Well, this does beg the question of whether the MDBs are the appropriate instrument to, in fact, affect this transition. I would contend that they are one of the appropriate instruments to do it. And I think the power of the MDBs lies particularly not in accomplishing the transition that's necessary in the United States, or perhaps even in China, but in a set of countries where a great deal of investment is needed over the next 25 years in order to engender sustainable growth. And the investment has to be done in a way that is going to be carbon sustainable and sustainable in any other ways. And you need a certain expertise. The fundamental problem of development finance over the last 10, 15 years has been you have a large pool of global capital earning very little interest, where you have projects in developing countries that, in fact, return lots of interest. And it's difficult to make the connection to, and it has to do with risk, it has to do with institutions. There are a whole set of reasons that we know. The MDBs are the glue that can connect those two. And I think there's a way to structure the lending of the MDBs in order to do that well. Whether the current structure is correct or not is a subject for another week's worth of seminars, I think, and many of my colleagues at the Center for Global Development are working on that. But what the MDBs offer is an insight into development and an insight into financial markets. And they put the two together, I think, or could put the two together in an effective way. As to how many MDBs currently exist, I don't know the number off the top of my head. I can count 6 or 8 on my fingers. Most of them are owned by countries. So the World Bank's shareholders are the countries of the world, about 200 countries of the world. They have shares in the capital of the Multilateral Development Bank. The regional multilateral development banks usually are predominantly owned by the countries of the region. So the African Development Bank, if my recollection serves me, has over 50% of its capital owned by African countries, and of non-African countries own the other 50%. And so it varies a bit, but these are global institutions owned by countries and managed by an appointed management that are appointed by the boards, which are run by these countries. I think that answers the question. If not, come back.
I think underlying Diane's question is an interesting issue that, if you're right, Mark, in saying countries will make their own decisions on your proposal, you could imagine some countries, Japan, for example, saying, well, we only want to give this to the ADB or something. And that would be an interesting dynamic. Matthias, did you want to add anything?
Oh, yeah. What I would say is I think that I would differentiate, the use of that for development purposes. The notion is that be that SDRs or even there was a debate before, this huge amount of reserves that all these developing countries that do have them, Brazil, for example, just to give an example, they're sitting on $350 billion. That's a waste of resources. But my suggestion would be that has been the mechanism by which in the flexible dollar standard, some countries have been able, in the absence of capital controls, to more or less weather through the financial instability of this sort of system. So I would be reluctant. If you ask me, I remember discussions in Brazil about a sovereign fund for that money, and I'm reluctant to, because Brazil at that time, for example, when it was growing, Brazil hasn't been growing since 2015. Brazil does have a large development bank, or that it's there, and it's allows the BNDES allowed for the funding of lots of projects, not just at that point in Brazil itself, but around the region. Of course, that had all sorts of consequences with the corruption trials and so on and so forth. But Brazil was an important presence, not just in Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, but also in African countries and so on and so forth. So I think that once you have a certain level that permits to isolate, the sort of vagaries of financial flows, then there is a space to talk about what uses you have for these extra funds, and of course, then I think, as Mark was saying, national governments. I haven't read the proposal, but it seems the logical thing would be national governments are the most appropriate place to sort of think of what they do need to promote development.
Great. So we'll go to 2 more questions. One is from Amanda, who said, I'd like to know, in Mark and Matthias's perspectives, how can Asian banks and currencies affect the international currency system? So I think it'd be good if we could discuss, China's rising role, because I think most people see that as the one of the potential alternatives to the dollar's role in the international currency system. And then, Roy, you said you had a question as well. Do you want to turn on your screen?
Yes. You want me to go next?
Yes. We'll put those 2 together. Yeah.
Okay. It's a question to Mark about his MDB proposal. As you know, Mark, over 50% of the low-income countries are either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. And there is a history about MDB involvement in creating the debt problem, and that led to the multilateral debt restructuring initiative in which you played a part yourself. So I'm just wondering if the proposal to channel SDRs through MDBs founders upon the debt vulnerability of particularly the lowest income countries, because they don't need loans, they need grants, basically, grant financing.
So Matthias, do you want to take the first question from Amanda?
Sure. there is an effort by China to internationalize the renminbi, or yuan, whatever you want to call it. I mean, they certainly, part of their presence in Africa, and there is significant amounts of loans. Argentina itself does have a sort of a swap agreement there of equivalent to $20 billion or whatever that is, but it's in yuan, and so there is an effort, and so I think that that's certainly part of the story. I mean, I think that what backs that is the important influence that China has had throughout Asia on the changes in the structure of production, and that's backed by the extensive and large sort of Silk Road initiative. So the United States doesn't have at this point something equivalent. I mean, the Fed has done swap exchanges with central banks in some places, depending on the circumstances. They're small, they're not particularly large, and they certainly, I mean, the US does have access to the IMF. I mean, at the IMF, it still to a great extent responds to the interest in the US, and the US has not been particularly happy in extending the use of the SDRs. So not just Congress, the IMF itself, and that suggests the Treasury. And that has been bipartisan to some extent. So that's why I'm not sure what happens, in terms of congressional interest on this, because it's not just, Republicans that would be sort of against. I mean, there are lots of interest of Wall Street within the Democratic Party that also don't think are particularly interested in switching away from the dollar and giving more role to the SDR and so on and so forth. But when you look at the numbers, the problem of thinking of the yuan as a threat to the position of the dollar, in terms of numbers, I haven't checked, the IMF recently, but if it's 2-3% of reserves that are held in yuan, it's more or less that. 30% or so, it's still in euros. And so the real challenge was, and everybody thought up to 10 years ago when, the Greek crisis and the European, that crisis sort of took place, that the euro was the possible alternative. So that has sort of vanished, that discussion. I think that the current situation in Europe doesn't bode well for any thought of the euro as the dominant currency. So the dollar is there to some extent by default, because there is no significant currency that can take the place. So on that, I think that Eichengreen that has suggested that is correct. So I don't see anytime soon anything that can step on the place of the dollar.
Great. Mark, do you want to, I don't know if you want to comment on that or directly on Roy's question?
Well, let me talk about Roy's question. I agree with what Mateus was saying on the Asian currencies. I think it'll be interesting to see how they evolve over the next decade very much. On the debt problem, I think you alluded to it at the beginning, Eric. We're entering a period where debt is becoming a real problem again. And in some sense, with low interest rates and even negative real interest rates, we could all muddle along nicely and not worry too much about it, because lending or borrowing was very, very cheap. This is simply not the case anymore. And for the lowest of income countries, I think it's right. Roy is right that we're going to need a substantial amount of grants, and this proposal will not solve that problem. I aim more at the middle income countries, which are going to have a substantial amount of investment, particularly in energy, in order to grow, and the lower middle income countries in particular. And there, someone's going to have to undertake this investment, and it's going to be a bit more costly to do it in a environmentally responsible way. And the question is, who's going to take on that investment? The rich countries aren't in a position to give more grants, and so I think the only possibility is the MDBs to do this. I think they have to do it in a way that recognizes that we have to think in a slightly different way about debt sustainability. If this investment doesn't get made, we're going to have serious problems down the road. We're going to have environmental problems that are existential in nature. And so we're going to have to, in fact, allow countries to borrow a bit more money. But how you sustain that, I think, is questionable. Again, I think one of the problems, too, has been that a lot of these emerging countries have borrowed at very high interest rates. I mean, they got access to international capital markets, but at rather high rates. And it's because they couldn't access the kind of money they wanted from the multilateral development banks at lower rates. And so, again, I think expanding the power of the MDBs, but rethinking a bit the notion of debt sustainability. And as you said, Eric, coming up with a plan to deal with countries when they do run into debt problems in a consistent way. These are all pieces of the puzzle. So I'm not going to pretend that the SDRs are going to be the solution to the entire problem that's before us, but I think it's one component of the solution. Thanks.
Great, thanks. So formally we're out of time, but we do have one more question, which if the panelists are okay, just staying for a few extra minutes. Is that okay, Mark and Matthias? Yeah. Okay. So Mario Zaccaretti has a question. This is a question from Mark. Why go through this back door via the SDRs in order to fund public investments internationally? Why not get governments internationally from the developed world to earmark directly a greater portion of their budgets for tackling this elephant in the room? It seems to be far superior than to create debt for those countries via the MDBs. So, and if I can just before you answer that, Mark, if I can just leave Matthias also with one direct question, which comes directly on your comments about the renminbi. I guess the one thing I'd like to hear your views on, Matthias, just because I've been reading a lot about it lately, is do you think the Chinese digital currency project changes your views about the prospects for the renminbi becoming a more serious international currency in the short to medium term? So, Mark.
The answer to Mario's question is yes, that would be a much more superior, that would be a far superior way of doing things. But in fact, the sad reality is that official development assistance, the kind of financing that's needed, has been stagnant over the last 10 years. It's gone up a little bit, but not much. Countries in the developed world, advanced countries, economies are in much more difficult budgetary situations now than they were a few years ago, given COVID, given Ukraine. And you look ahead and you don't see the budgetary possibilities of that happening. I'm sitting here in London, and I'm watching the UK government do everything it can to limit the amount of money that it gives directly to developing countries. And they're favoring multilateral solutions for a variety of reasons. And I think multilateralism offers a potential for advancement that bilateral aid doesn't necessarily offer. It's often a political decision. People don't believe in aid, okay? And people have to believe why you're giving aid and what the impact is going to be. And that's part of the problem is going to be convincing people that aid should be given and the multilateral development bank should be a way of doing it. The case has to be remade. I think there was a consensus around this 20 years ago that doesn't exist anymore. So very much I agree with you, Mario. That's the better way to go. But in the interim, you have a pool of resources sitting relatively idle that I think could be used without great cost. So that's the genesis of my proposal.
Yes.
Interesting enough, on that consensus on aid, I think a crucial role was played by one of the students of Lance Taylor, who was my supervisor too, and I should say just passed away, Bill Easterly. You know, his book was very influential, and I think it did promote this view that aid is not particularly useful. But yeah, maybe I'm off the mark. So I cannot say I know a lot about the project for the digital Chinese currency. What I can say is that for a long while I've been a skeptic. So if you go to my blog, it's called Naked Keynesianism. I haven't written a lot on the blog, but the blog used to have some readership. It has like 4 million something hits, and back when all of this cryptocurrency sort of appeared, I was sort of skeptical on that, and I remain quite skeptical. So I do think that central bank currencies will eventually become digital for security reasons, this, that, and the other, but they're national currencies. So my tendency would be to think that those digital currencies will still have to be related, to the either those two explanations of what explains why a currency is hegemonic. So I don't see it as something new in that respect. So my guess is if it's just a private digital currency, then it's very much like an asset for speculation, and it adds to the noise in the financial system, but not necessarily to the solution of the problems that developing countries might have. But again, I don't know enough about this, so I'm saying this in a broad, general sort of sense, not in particular about the Chinese digital currency.
Incidentally, just for the audience sake, the debates around digital currency are really heating up everywhere in the world right now. And they also relate to Mark's proposal because some people believe it would be easier to make the SDR more attractive if all central banks are moving to digital currencies, like public digital currencies. Well, thank you very much to both of you. Really fascinating presentations and really great perspectives on this question, which Roy gave us of, if you remember, the title of this panel was Transforming the International Currency System. And I think Matthias's answer is, it's not going to happen for a while. And Mark's answer is, I hope it happens in one specific dimension in terms of the SDR playing a larger role and a different role in some ways. So thanks very much to both of you and to Roy for organizing this panel. And thanks to the audience for your great comments and questions and for participating.
If I may also interject that our discussion on Wednesday, is going to continue this debate on future digital currencies, including central bank digital currencies. So we haven't heard the last word, and more is to come. But I'd like to add my thanks to Eric's, to our two distinguished speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.